In the last section, we created our new reusable input component. The whole purpose of this input component is just to wrap a text input and make it look nice. Remember, by default, that text input has absolutely zero styling, and so I don't want to have to add in the styling every single time that I want to use the text input. So inside our component now, we'll place our text input and then immediately start to add in some styling here as well. So I'll place my text input. And I expect to have to give it a lot of different properties, so I'll give myself a little space to add in some props here. We'll add in, to start, a hard-coded style of height 20 and a width of 100, just like we had before. So maybe just before we start working on the styling too much, let's focus on making sure that we can use this input inside of our login form. So specifically what I'm talking about here is we've got a little bit of a challenge ahead of us. Our text input that we create inside of the login form, remember this is the primitive component right here, had that entire system with state and on change, callback, and the value and blah, 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 all that kind of great stuff. So we need to make sure that when we replace this text input right here with the input that we just created, the reusable version of it, we need to make sure that our component also respects these value and on change text properties as well. So it is not as bad as it might sound. Trust me, let's do the refactor and see how it works out. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to realize that I don't really want the text input from the React Native library inside of my login form anymore. I want to replace it with our homegrown version, our reusable component version. So I'm going to take out that import statement because we don't need React Native anymore inside this file for right now. And instead, we will import the input tag that we just created. And then I will replace the text input with the input. So now this is our component right here. This is our component through and through. We already added in the style tag to the text input inside of our component, so we'll take this one out for now. But we are going to leave in the props of value and on change text. So all we have to do to make sure that this thing works correctly, make sure that the state of that text input is still reflected on the login form state. We just have to make sure that we pass the props of value and on change text to the text input inside of our component. So we will flip over to our input right here. We will receive the value and on change text props, and then we're going to pass them directly into the text input. So value is value, and on change text is on change text. So let me pause here for a second, and I want to acknowledge, yes, this last step probably seemed a little bit weird, a little bit strange, but I promise you it makes more sense than you might think if it seems confusing. Our login form is responsible for figuring out what the text input state is, right? Like what the actual field's text is, what its value is. So any single time that the user types inside that field, we want to invoke this fat arrow function, right? Like that's the goal. So we are passing that fat arrow function as a prop down into the input we created. Okay, we're passing it as a prop to the input we created. So now in our input, we are receiving that prop. So we're receiving the on change text prop, and we're just passing it right along to the text input. And this text input right here is the primitive version of the input. It is the thing that's actually receiving text from the user. I feel like if there's probably one really confusing part about this, in my opinion, it's the fact that I chose a component name of input right here. If it makes more sense, you might think of this component instead as like field or something like that. Anything that kind of separates it in meaning from this text input. Okay, so enough lecturing about that. The last thing we have to do is work on the styling for the rest of this component right here. And maybe before that, let's just do a quick test, make sure everything is still working inside the simulator. So I can click in here. Yep, looks good. And yeah, I can still type stuff in here. You'll notice that there's a little bit of white margin up here as well right now that we didn't have before. That's being caused by the text tag. We're not passing a label to it right now, so it's just taking up some arbitrary white space up there. So we'll make sure that we will want to make sure that we also pass in a label from the login form as well at some point. Okay, let's take a quick break and then come back and finish up the styling on this entire input element.